In those systems, therefore, which are characterized by a fixed general self-sameness, this means that both the cognitive side and the things themselves remain self-same. But this expansion of the self-identical determinateness, each of which describes the course of its progress unhindered and with scope for free play, leads of necessity equally to its opposite, to the confusion of these determinatenesses. For the differentia, the general characteristic is the unity of opposites, of what is determinate and what is in itself universal. It must therefore split up into this antithesis. If now, on the one side, the determinateness gains the ascendancy over the universal in which it has its essence, on the other side again, this universal equally maintains its control over that determinateness, pushes it to its boundary, and there mixes up its distinctions and essentialities. Observation, which kept them properly apart and believed that in them it had something firm and settled, sees principles overlapping one another, transitions and confusions developing. What it at first took to be absolutely separate, it sees combined with something else, and what it reckoned to be in combination, it sees apart and separate. So it is that observation, which clings to passive, unbroken self-sameness of being, inevitably sees itself tormented just in its most general determinations. For example, of what are the differentiae of an animal or a plant, by instances which rob it of every determination, invalidate the universality to which it had risen, and reduce it to an observation and description which is devoid of thought. In paragraph 247, we're now going to take a closer look at the differentiae, or rather we're going to look at a certain perspective that uses the differentiae to try to make sense out of things, which is what reason wants to do. And let's remind ourselves a little bit before we go into this paragraph and the paragraphs to follow about what is going on here. So we're in this section, reason. Reason has everything for it in an implicit way. So that means that the rationality or intelligibility that reason is finding is out there in things. It's observing reason, right? And so it's observing nature. It's observing the world in which it finds itself. And it is finding some sort of intelligibility or rationality out there because it's already there for consciousness. So there's a correspondence between the world outside of the ego, the individual, the consciousness, and the consciousness itself. Now, this correspondence is one that is continually disrupted by the process of actually looking at things and finding out, no, I've got them wrong in certain respects. I need to revise what I'm thinking about or making of these things. Now, the differentiae, as we saw in the previous paragraph, play an incredibly important role in making sense out of things. Why is that? Well, we can tell what things are in part by distinguishing them from other things. And what we're going to see here is Hegel is going to examine how that works out when we try to assume, you might say, a universe of fixed essences that we just have to go out there and discover. Essences which would be separated from each other, which we could find in individual things. And the sort of dream or goal of certain ancient, and this runs all the way through to contemporary ways of looking at things, is of setting up something sort of like a tree where you have being as such at the top, and then you start going down into genuses or regions of being, if you prefer that language, and then we get more and more differentiated as we get further down. So being, animate being, maybe that doesn't deserve to be a top category, I don't know, but let's just assume it does. Animate being, rational animate being, right? Human being, because maybe there's other rational animate beings, and we can go further and further down. And the things that differentiate ought to keep them distinct from other things in that tree process. Hegel is going to show us that when we rely on that sort of thing, we often end up in difficulties and perplexities and trouble. So, He says, in systems which are characterized by a fixed general self-sameness, right, where we assume that they just are what they are, the law of identity, as we normally think about it, applies all across the board, there's no dynamism, things don't develop, right? In these systems, we can assume a kind of correspondence between the cognitive side. What Miller's translating as cognitive side is in German erkennen, or sometimes translated as cognition, right? This means the cognitive side and the things themselves remain self-same. So we actually have three things that are remaining self-same. We have what is holding them together, these systems. We have the things themselves, presumably out there in the world. We have our own conception of them. And since the things themselves are remaining self-same, our conception of them should remain self-same. Or if we want to go the other way, since our conception of them is as being self-same, the things themselves had better remain self-same. Now, that's all great unless things don't remain self-same. And as we know, within the Hegelian viewpoint on things, nothing ever remains self-same. The self-same actually repels itself from itself and is attracted in some way to what is other than it, right? So when we see this, being framed in this way, it's just like when we see Hegel use the word immediate. We should know, hey, there's going to be some reversal coming up, so let's watch and see what that is. So Hegel says, this expansion of the self-identical determinateness, each of which describes a course of its progress unhindered and with scope for free play, notice that, it's developing and there has to be some sort of lack of hindrance, there has to be some free play, leads of necessity to its opposite, to the confusion of these determinatenesses. What are the determinatenesses that he's talking about? The systems, and then these, not component parts, but rather what we might call perspectives, both of which, by the way, are in consciousness. Consciousness out in the world, consciousness observing the world, right? So how does this play out? He says, the differentia, the general characteristic, is the unity of opposites. What is determinate and what is in itself universal. It must therefore split up into this antithesis. Okay, so what is he talking about there? Well, sort of like when we talked very early on in the consciousness section about how universals actually work, and we said, there's a bit more paradoxicality to universals because they are the things that they are, and they're also not what they are, and they also make the things that they are the universal of the things that they are, and yet wouldn't exist as a universe, and we can go on and on and on, right? So same sort of thing is happening here. The determinateness of what is being differentiated is one side, and the universality of it is another side. So, let's use some prosaic examples, right? I should have brought more ties out here so I can do this. So, I've got a tie that I'm wearing. You just have to remember other ties that I've worn in my videos and imagine other ties that you might be wearing, and so on and so forth, right? There's a universality to this, and we can talk in terms of ties in general. So if you say, in a very pragmatic way, you say, I need to go buy a tie. You don't necessarily think blue tie with white dots in the middle in a square pattern or anything necessarily like that. But that's determinateness, right? Or at least we think that it's determinateness. We'll get there in a minute. So universality. Universality for tie not only includes this tie with this pattern, it also includes blue striped ties, it also includes red striped ties, it also includes red solid ties, it also includes black ties, and so on and so forth, right? The tie writ large. And tie writ large doesn't actually have the determinateness of having color. Tie writ large isn't necessarily made out of whatever this is made out of. Probably, what is it? Silk. There we go. Some of my ties are made of silk, others I think are made of other things. I don't really know because I'm not a person who cares much about ties. I'm more interested in the universal than I am in the determinateness. Now, let's think a little bit more about this determinateness. So we said that this tie has certain properties that as determinate set it apart from the universal tie that give it determinate being, right? Like being blue, being made of silk, having this pattern, being of a certain length. You can tell just exactly how long it is by looking at how much tie there is, and going on from there. That said, that determinateness is a differentia, isn't it? Because it sets it apart from other ties. So within the universal, which is part of what is being, determined out here, this whole play takes place again at further and further and further levels, depending on what we're actually looking at. Hegel notes that we have a similar problem here. We're not dealing with artifacts at this point. We're thinking in terms of, say, animals, plants, physical phenomena. He says, if on the one side the determinateness gains the ascendancy over the universal in which it has its essence, on the other side the universal equally maintains its control over that determinateness, pushes it to its boundary, there mixes up its distinctions and essentiality. So these exist in a dynamic tension with each other. No determinateness, well then you get no universal, right? Because you don't have a universal if you don't have some things that universal is the universal for. On the other hand, determinateness by itself doesn't mean anything without having the universal that provides a kind of index for it. And they both kind of war or struggle or conflict with each other. Both of them would like to be the whole thing for consciousness. Both of them are sort of striving with each other within the thing itself for Hegel. What does this lead to? He says observation wants to keep them strictly apart, right? Wants to differentiate between determinateness and universality. What happens then? He says it believed in them and had something firm and settled, right? You can say, okay, here's the universal, here's the various determinateness, right? We keep everything the same. He goes on, he says, it sees principles overlapping one another. And this is what I've tried to depict down here, right? And I'm not saying this is a very good, iconic representation of principles overlapping each other, but I don't know how you're possibly going to put that onto a chalkboard. You have to think here. This is sort of conceptual thinking as opposed to representative Vorstellung thinking. Principles are overlapping each other, right? Transitions and confusions developing. What it took at first to be absolutely separate, it sees combined with something else. What it reckoned to be in combination, it sees apart and separate. This is part of the dialectical process. There's a dynamism there, and that dynamism doesn't just extend to, say, the things themselves as growing and all that. It has to do even with these sort of categories, or if you like, logical divisions, or however you want to think about it. It has to do with the very nature of being itself. And so observing reason observing nature, finds out that when it assumes this fixed self-sameness there, that doesn't actually hold up. So he goes on and he says, it sees the observation which clings to passive, unbroken self-sameness of being, inevitably sees itself tormented just in its most general determinations. For example, what are the differentiae of an animal or a plant? By instances which rob it of every determination, invalidate the universality to which it had risen, and reduce it to an observation and description which is devoid of thought. Remember back just several paragraphs before, we had this activity of description, which we saw Hegel calling thoughtless, or unthinking, right? Gedankenlose was the German for it. And that is the risk of what we would fall into. That would be a regression. Instead, what we're going to see in the paragraphs to come is a rethinking of what is going on here, and maybe looking at, well, what's the problem? It's this assumption of fixed general determinations that just stay the same. Observation which confines itself in this way to what is simple, or restrains the scattered sensuous elements by the universal, thus finds in its object the confusion of its principle, because what is determinate must, through its own nature, lose itself in its opposite. Reason must therefore move on from the inert determinateness which had a show of permanence to observing it as it is in truth, that is, as relating itself to its opposite. What are called differentiae are passive determinatenesses which, when expressed and apprehended as simple, do not represent their nature, which is to be vanishing moments of a movement which returns back into itself. Since reason now reaches the stage of looking for the determinateness as something which essentially is not for itself, but which passes over into its opposite, it seeks for the law and the notion of the determinateness. True, it seeks for them equally as an actuality in the form of immediate being, but this will in fact vanish for it, and the aspects of the law become pure moments or abstractions, so that the law comes to light in the nature of the notion, which is destroyed within itself the indifferent subsistence of sensuous reality. In the previous paragraph, we saw observing reason getting itself embroiled and you might say embarrassed by its failure to understand the beings that it's attempting to make sense of. And as Hegel said, winding up in sort of a mess of overlapping principles and determinations, all of which were supposed to be distinct from each other, differentiated from each other. And the problem was that it didn't take account of the dynamic movement within these things that it's trying to make sense of, and consciousness's own role. Here in paragraph 248, we're going to see the beginnings of that, and it's going to lead us into some very interesting new steps that Hegel wants to unroll from this. So we have to imagine ourselves in the role of consciousness at the beginning of this movement of reason, very optimistic, and then suddenly being sort of dismayed. Now, what comes after that? Reason wants to find a solution. So Hegel talks, and I sort of adumbrated this sentence right here. What is determinate must lose itself in its opposite. He actually says, instead of that short thing, he says that what is determinate must, through its own nature, lose itself in its opposite. And observation finds in its object the confusion of its principle, right? The principle of trying to make sense out of things, trying to differentiate things. Differentiating means holding things apart in opposition. So if you're losing yourself in your opposite, or becoming, as Hegel is calling it here, as he's called it so many other times, something becoming a vanishing moment, you're not accomplishing that. So how might you then make some sort of progress? Okay, so we've got the progress sort of charted here on the board. He says, observation that confines itself in this way to what is simple or restrains the scattered sensuous elements by the universal. It's going to run into these problems. It must move on from the inert determinateness which had a show of permanence, right? So what do we got here? This is that first starting point. Observation, that's part of what reason is doing, is observing the simple, inert, sensuous determinateness, right? And it's doing this with multiple things and trying to make sense of them. Now, what is it really observing in this case? What we saw in the last two paragraphs is it's really observing the differentiae. And these differentiae are being themselves understood as passive, but also as determinateness. And we saw that there's this play between determinateness and the universal involved there as well. But this is not working out for it. Why not? Well, that because we pass over to the next step, which is passing over into its opposite. Both in terms of the differentiae, they have this internal contradiction in which both parts are passing over into each other, and when we try to make sense of the differentiae as a tool in order to really distinguish things from each other, we find that we get this overlapping network of stuff instead of a nice handy tree, right? So he says, since reason now reaches the stage of looking for the determinateness as something which essentially is not for itself, right? It's not for itself. It is for an other, and what is its other? The other is the both consciousness and the other that it's passing over into. Its opposite, right? So what does he say? Reason is not going to just watch this and say, oh, things didn't work out. Maybe I should go back to the earlier stages of Stoicism and skepticism and the master-slave dialect. No, reason doesn't do that. Reason says, I think I can figure this out. And remember, what is reason seeking in all of this? Reason is seeking the truth of the phenomena. So what it's going to do is strive for grasping, as Hegel says, the law and the notion of the determinateness. Now he's speaking in the singular here, but we can pick whatever determinateness we want, because he's talking about trying to do this with things in the world that we're trying to observe and make sense of. So he says, it seeks for the law and the notion of the determinants. True, it seeks for them equally as an actuality in the form of immediate being. Okay, so there's a little concession, right? It's not quite conceptualized just how hard this is going to be, but this will in fact vanish for it, and the aspects of the law become pure moments or abstractions. So the law comes to light in the nature of the notion, which is destroyed within itself, the indifferent subsistence of sensuous reality. Now notice, sensuous reality is what we started with over here. The differentiae were already getting us away from sensuous reality into things that we could, say we were talking about in terms of concepts or notions, right, ideas, and things that we could regularize or provide a kind of underlying intelligibility to. That's what law is. And that takes us out of the directly pure, sensuous world, doesn't it? It introduces something else. Notice that what we're going to be seeing here is much of the same territory that we have traversed earlier in the consciousness section, particularly in the paragraphs to come in the force and the understanding section. So this is a very important transition that's taking place here, from reason trying to engage in observation, thinking that the things are just going to kind of hold still, to realizing it needs a much wider net, the net that's going to be provided by law. To the observing consciousness, the truth of the law is found in experience, in the same way that sensuous being is an object for consciousness, is not in and for itself. But if the law does not have its truth in the notion, it is a contingency, not a necessity, not, in fact, a law. But the fact that it is essentially in the form of notion not only does not conflict with its being accessible to observation, but rather for that very reason gives it a necessary existence and makes it an object for observation. The universal in the sense of the universality of reason is also universal in the sense implied in the above notion. That is, it is for consciousness, that it displays itself as something present and actual. In other words, the notion displays itself in the form of thinghood and sensuous being, but it does not on that account lose its nature, nor relapse into an inert subsistence or an indifferent succession. What is universally valid is also universally effective. What ought to be, in fact, also is. And what only ought to be without actually being has no truth. The instinct of reason, for its part, rightly holds firmly to this standpoint and refuses to be led astray by figments of thought, which only ought to be, and as oughts, are credited with truth, although they are nowhere met with in experience, or by hypothesis, as little as by all the other invisible entities of a perennial ought. For reason is just this certainty of possessing reality, and what is not present for consciousness is something existing in its own right. That is, what does not appear is for consciousness nothing at all. In paragraph 249, this idea of law is really central. We saw in 248 that reason is going to get away from just engaging with sort of willy-nilly observation and trying to parse out everything in terms of the differentiae by looking to a conception of law. And we saw that law has to be connected with notion in some way. And Hegel is actually parsing that out here in this paragraph. He's also going to say some things that are really fascinating and of much wider import than just the progression that's going on in this paragraph towards the end part of the paragraph, and that is what we've got over here. He's going to say that these insights are something that, observing reason in its early stages, in its instinctual activity is, you might say, assuming without actually putting into explicit form. But much later it's going to put these into an explicit form. So let's see what's actually being said here. He says, we've got two polarities, right? We've got the truth of the law being found in experience with the sensuous particulars, the determinateness is what Hegel is using here. And what we've got here is sensuous being, and this is a realm of contingency. And that is what law must actually bear upon if it's going to be a law at all, because otherwise what the hell is it about? Is it just about, pure abstract objects? That would be fine for, say, mathematical laws, right? But we're interested in observing nature, the things that we're encountering. Those are contingent. Those are sensuous. We have to experience those. And so if a law can't tell us something about those, then what the hell good is it, right? On the other hand, if it's going to be a law, we have to have this side of the notion, of the universal, of necessity. Because like Hegel is going to say here, here we go, if the law does not have its truth in the notion, it is a contingency, not a necessity, not, in fact, a law. So the fundamental question that we're asking here, and it's a trick question, because there's two answers to it that mutually imply each other, is where is the truth of the law? Where does it reside? Does it reside solely in the necessity? If that was the case, we would have to leave this part out, and then the law wouldn't actually have any application. And we've already seen that dialectic play out in Forcing the Understanding, haven't we? On the other hand, if we focused on this and said, well, we actually do have to experience the truth of the law, and we lose sight of this part up here, the universal, the notion, we lose the very character of a law. You see how there's this, sort of hard kernel of things. Actually, it's more like a knot tied together where, although we'd like to, have just one portion or the other portion, we got to take the whole package. And if we don't, we're going to lose law. And that is what consciousness observing is actually finding out. So he says, the truth of the law is found in experience in the same way the sensuous being is an object for consciousness. It is not an in and for itself, right? But if the law doesn't have its truth in the notion, that's a problem. So he goes on and he says, the universal in the sense of the universality of reason is also universal in the sense implied in the above notion, that it is for consciousness, that it displays itself as something present and actual. How does it do that? It displays itself as something present and actual by existing in the world of sensibility, experience, contingency, as a universal. You might say it erupts into the world and provides it a kind of structure, if we want to be very phenomenological in the, not Hegelian, but more Heideggerian sense with that. So he goes on and he says, in other words, the notion displays itself in the form of thinghood and sensuous being. So there's a direct connection between the notion and sensuous being. This is not an abstraction out there just in our consciousness. We're finding the notion there in the world, in the things. Now, he says it does not on that account lose its nature nor relapse into an inert substance or an indifferent succession. Rather, what we should think about it as doing is, as notion, as universal in the Hegelian sense, bringing a kind of dynamism that the sensuous being by itself would lack, and lacking which would only be an inert substance, which couldn't really be made sense of. Law is involving both of these two polarities, but where the real emphasis is here in this paragraph is on how the notion itself is grasped in experience in a way that is not reducible to sensibility but does involve sensibility. So he goes on and he says, what is universally valid is also universally effective. What ought to be, in fact, also is, and what only ought to be without actually being has no truth. And that's what I put here on the board. And you might say, well, that's kind of a huge metaphysical digression, isn't it? Well, it's actually illustrating what we're talking about here. So let's look at this paragraph and then let's look at the application. There's a play on words, too, that I want to signal. So that's why I put the German on the board. What is universally valid is universally effective. So what is allgemein gültig, right, is universally effective, geltend. These are both coming from the same root, right? And so gültig, geltend, these are both having to do with sort of like acceptability. Geld is coming from the term Geld, gold, money is involved there, but it's being used in a more abstract sense of being something that is passable, something that Miller's translating here as effective. We could say something that can work, right? Something that is workable, we say. So what is universally valid, what has the kind of capacity to demand our assent as consciousness, as saying, yeah, okay, that really is the way things are, is also something that has a kind of activity or agency to it. It can get things done. What ought to be, sein soll, in fact also is in der Tat, is in actuality, is in action, we could say. What only ought to be without being has no truth. This is a pretty far-reaching doctrine here, isn't it? And it could be taken a lot of different ways. Some people have mistakenly taken Hegel when he's talking about this sort of thing to be like the ultimate conformist, to be saying, yeah, forget idealism altogether in the sense of like thinking things could possibly ever be any different than they are. In order to say something like that, you have to totally misunderstand Hegel and ignore almost everything else that he says. But people have taken in that sense. How should we understand it here? In order for the notion that is one side of the law to actually be effective or valid, it has to be out there in the things and be able to be, you might say, seen or sensed by us. Not purely reducible to that, but it has to be out there doing something. So Hegel says consciousness actually grasps all of this. He says, the instinct of reason rightly holds firmly to this standpoint that says, look, if it doesn't have any real, effective being, let's not talk about it. Let's not pretend that it actually matters. He says, it refuses to be led astray by figments of thought which only ought to be, and as oughts are credited with truth, though they're nowhere met with in experience. Think about how many things that people talk about and even may think are sort of stand-ins for whatever science means to them. And when you get down to it, they can't tell you much about them other than repeating themselves or repeating what they read in some popular science review or website. And they can't tell you where they meet with it in experience in any real way. They can say, well, I use this to interpret what's happening. There's a lot of things in our time, in Hegel's time, in previous times that are like that. And you might say that observing reason is very hard-nosed. It's saying, look, don't bother me with your nonsense if you can't show me where the hell it actually is. It doesn't have to be reducible to the sensuous, but it sure must be met with somewhere in it, or else don't try to tell me all about this stuff. So he goes on and he says, reason is this certainty of possessing reality. What is not present for consciousness as something existing in its own right, that is, what does not appear, is for consciousness nothing at all. Nothing at all at this stage in the game, we should say. This is a major realization, and it's going to affect the way in which law is now reinterpreted in the passages yet to come.